Good evening, everybody. We have, I can imagine, a very interesting talk today on the life of Frantz Fanon, who lived from 1925 to 1961, a psychiatrist from, I forget the Caribbean island he came from, Ken, but you're going to introduce him.
Martinique.
What was it? Sorry?
Martinique.
Martinique, that's it, Martinique. And so Ken Syme is going to introduce this man to us as a life of the left, a very interesting and important one. Over to you, Ken.
Right. Good evening, comrades. I'm going to do a brief introduction to Frantz Fanon's life and work. I say it's a brief introduction. His was actually quite a brief life. If you look at the dates in the slide in front of you, you'll see that actually his political life, or significant political life, only really lasted, by some reckonings, 8 years. So I'll just sort of briefly take us through the point, his beginnings to his political engagement. He was born in 1925 on the French island of Martinique, which at that time was a colony of France. And he doesn't appear to have been particularly politically engaged in his early life. The first indications of any sort of political inclinations came with the Second World War. And during the Second World War, in 1941, the French governor of Martinique was rather sympathetic to the Vichy French, and in effect established something like a military dictatorship on Martinique. Now, Fanon at this point decided he wanted to fight with the Allies in the Second World War. It doesn't appear to have occurred to him that he could stay and fight for the rights of the natives of Martinique against the white occupiers. Instead, he chose, in effect, to try and fight with one set of white men against another. And his first attempt to do that involved trying to get to Dominica to join up with the British. That didn't actually work out. And in 1943, he came back to Martinique, which at that point had switched allegiances, largely due to the American blockade of the island. He then enlisted, went for his initial training in Algeria, and we'll obviously come back to Algeria later, fought in the Second World War, was actually decorated for bravery during an action on the Swiss border during the Second World War. And curiously, the signature at the bottom of the documents on his award for bravery was one Colonel Raoul Salah, who went on to become the commander of the French army in Algeria, and even worse, you might add, the commander of the OAS, but that's something we'll come back to later. So he served in the army, was demobilized, and returned to Martinique to in essence complete his education. And going back to a period before then, his teacher at school had been one Aimé Césaire, the famous French intellectual poet, writer. And when he returned to Martinique, we have the first indication of a real political engagement, because he helped with Césaire's campaign. Césaire was putting himself forward as a communist candidate for the First National Assembly of the Fourth Republic, and Fanon, with his brother, worked together on that campaign. Subsequently, he moved to Lyon to begin his studies, and as somebody who was, in effect, a wounded war veteran, that helped him to obtain a scholarship. Initially, he thought of studying dentistry, but that quickly sort of fell by the board, and he ended up specializing in psychiatry and ultimately neurosurgery and neuropsychiatry. But his time at Lyon wasn't by any means completely consumed by his medical studies. He read very widely outside of the simple, if you like, medical curriculum, though I recognize that's rather an insult to any medical student. He read Marx, Engels, Heidegger, Nietzsche, Husserl. He attended lectures by Merleau-Ponty. He actually wrote 3 plays, 2 of which have survived. One of them, A Drowning Eye, and 2, the second one, Parallel Hands. So he had an interest in philosophy and literature, and he was also quite involved in the political discussions at the time, because remember, this was just after the Second World War in France. Existentialism was very much to the fore, with Camus and Sartre both active at that period. He attended multiple political meetings, but he doesn't appear to have aligned himself to any particular group during this time. And he completed his studies, and after a sort of placement in France and an unsuccessful attempt to get a posting back to Martinique, he ultimately opted for a posting to Algeria, where, as I said, he'd done his initial military training. He had married, while he was in Lyon, a lady called Marie-Joseph Duplay, known afterwards as Josie. She was herself quite active politically. She was also studying in Lyon, studying liberal arts. And it is reported that for the most part, he dictated his books to her because, depending on which version you believe, he didn't like the physical act of writing itself, or more basically, he couldn't type. It's not clear exactly how far either of those explanations are true, but it's certainly true that his wife played a significant part in helping him get his work published. His first book was Black Skin, White Masks, and that was actually published in 1952. However, he had begun working on that prior to going out to Algeria, and he developed some of its ideas, obviously influenced by the work he did in Algeria. Now, what was he doing in Algeria? He went to, as I said, Blida, the psychiatric clinic there. And he arrived shortly before the Algerian War of Independence began. And in the course of a relatively brief time there, as you'll see, it's barely a little more than 3 years that he spent in Algeria. He did actually treat patients, if you like, from both sides of the conflict, both those fighting for the National Liberation Army of Algeria, and actually many of those working on the French side, and we'll come back to that later on. The extent of his activities supporting the liberation struggle in Algeria isn't known with any real precision. He certainly helped to shelter patients in the clinic. He helped to facilitate meetings. He helped with the logistics of the movement. And this went on, as I said, for a little over 3 years. And ultimately, he was, if you like, discovered and sent into exile, which was at some level a relatively light punishment, if you like, for what he'd done. And the belief is that because he was known as a respected intellectual. I haven't really touched on his various psychiatric publications, which are actually quite considerable and remained influential well beyond his death. But as a sort of respected intellectual war veteran, etc., he was given the, as I said, relatively light option of exile to Tunis, where he spent the next few years and became, in effect, the ambassador for the National Liberation Army of Algeria. And he was their ambassador to Accra officially. He attended a number of meetings on their behalf, both in Africa and in Rome. He attended a variety of gatherings of Black artists and writers. And I'm going to sort of move on now to the next slide, which basically details the 4 books, because as I said, his life was brief, that are published under his name. You will note that the date of the last book is after his death in 1961. It is largely a compilation of essays and other writings that he'd done for, among other places, the Mujahid, the journal of the National Liberation Army of Algeria. But coming back to the first book, Black Skin, White Masks, and I'll add at this point that there is a reading list that will go with this talk, which will be put up on our website in due course. And in that reading list, you can find access to the texts of the first 3 books on this list. I haven't as yet been able to identify a free digital text for the 4th book, but if I succeed, I'll add it to the list. But anyway, the first book is more a psychological exploration of race and racism and how that impacts people's lives, because that was very much at the forefront of his mind and something that he had realized was a significant part in people's lives during his time as a student in France, because at the time he was in Lyon, Black students were very much in the minority, and he began to observe the way people reacted differently depending on the color of the skin of the person they were talking to. So that was, as I said, largely driven by his psychological interests, by his interest in existentialism. We then come on to a dying colonialism, which, as the name suggests, deals largely with the issues of the colonizers and the colonized. And these are the writings for which he's probably most famous and most often remembered. His writings on colonialism and its impact on people have influenced the struggles in Latin America, the struggles in Africa, and more obscurely, perhaps, the 1979 revolution in Iran, for which The Wretched of the Earth was actually translated into Farsi. So his influence is quite widespread. In terms of how he saw the struggle for liberation, he was very much of the view that people in Africa should not strive to recreate a European model, that they should create a model that worked for them. And he, in The Wretched of the Earth, quite accurately anticipated the development of African countries post-independence, post the, if you like, departure of the colonizing powers from the continent. And he predicted that there would be a national bourgeoisie of the more educated, who were largely still thinking in European terms, who would in effect try to run the country along those lines and largely ignore the needs of those in the countryside, the needs of the peasants, if you like. And he was very much focused on the idea that those engaged in that struggle should look to develop a model that worked for their particular circumstances. Now, that doesn't mean that he was not an internationalist. He was very much an internationalist, but he also took the view that people should take into account the particular circumstances of their country when developing a model for government. And he was further of the view that a central government was very far from being the ideal model for any country, and favoured a model where there was significant autonomy for local districts, regions within that country, with some central government, obviously, but not a central government which tried to dictate to the entire population. Now, the model that's described in The Wretched of the Earth is an ideal model, one which sadly never really came to pass in Africa itself. He still campaigned very actively within those African countries struggling towards independence at the time, the Congo, Ghana, Kenya, and he was very much in touch with the leaders of those countries and also helped to facilitate delivery of arms and logistics to those engaged in that struggle. He carried on that work right up until the end of his life. He knew from a fairly early stage, from about 1960, that he had contracted leukemia, and he knew that he had very little time left. And in the letter to his editor that went with the Wretched of the Earth, he apologizes for the vehemence of the book, because it is a book written with a significant degree of passion. But he explained that he knew that the end of the process was approaching, and for that reason, he expressed himself with considerable passion. Now, there is, and always has been, a level of controversy around The Wretched of the Earth, particularly focused on the first chapter on violence. He is accused in some quarters of glorifying violence, of sort of disregarding the impact that violence had on people. I don't believe either of those charges are actually justified. He took the view that violence was the only means by which the colonized could free themselves, the colonizers. And the Algerian struggle is a particular case in point. That was a very long and bloody conflict. And the French were not at all scrupulous about the means of enforcing their rule of that country. They had it taught in the universities that the Algerians were basically an inferior people, naturally inclined to thievery, not to be trusted, intellectually less developed than Europeans. And those doctrines were ones that actually were believed by large parts of the French population. And these were doctrines that were taught to Algerian students in Algeria itself. So it was not remotely plausible that the French would depart simply on the basis of talks and negotiations. And it took many years for the Algerians to free themselves completely from French rule. And in fact, the only managed to succeed in that shortly after Fanon's death. But going back to the sort of the charges leveled on the violence front, I don't believe he glorified violence for violence's sake. He was very conscious as a psychiatrist of the damage it did to people on both sides of the conflict, because in a later section of The Wretched of the Earth, you can find a number of case studies where he treated people from both sides for the mental distress that had been caused them by their part in the conflict, from those fighting for independence who had been involved in planting bombs and the trauma that caused them, up to and including French who had participated in torture of Algerians and the distress that caused them. So he saw it from both sides and was quite conscious of the impact that violence had on those participating. But he nevertheless recognized that it was a necessary part of any people's journey towards independence. Now, the publication of The Wretched of the Earth took place in 1961, and it was almost immediately banned in France on publication on the grounds of it being that old chestnut, a threat to national security. That didn't stop it becoming a bestseller, in fact, and it remains one of the most widely read books on the struggle against colonialism. There was, in the original edition, a preface by Jean-Paul Sartre, quite a long preface, in fact. And shortly before his death, Fanon had gone to France to persuade Sartre to write the preface to his book. He had urged Sartre to be more active and more visible in campaigning for Algerian independence himself. He actually suggested to Sartre at one point that he should stop writing in protest against the conflict, or that he should get himself sent to prison, because both those things, Fanon believed, would cause a major national scandal in France. Well, Sartre didn't actually take up either of those options in the end, but he did write the preface. Later editions of the book don't feature that preface. And the reason for that is that in 1967, I believe, there was another outbreak in the Palestine-Israeli conflict. And Sartre actually came down on the side of Israel. And his widow, Josie Fanon, in an interview that she conducted in 1978, when she was back in America to take part in a conference against apartheid, was asked, why didn't it appear? And she did say the preface had been removed at her request because of Sartre's Zionist views. So The Wretched of the Earth remains a complex text. I won't attempt to summarize here all the arguments within the book. I'd urge everybody watching, if they haven't read it yet, to take advantage of the free link in the reading list and read the text for themselves. It's a perhaps more emotional work than people are used to in terms of political discussion, but it's a very powerful work, and it's a work which has continued to influence people throughout the 20th century and into our own century. So I'll conclude with a slide that contains an extract from a letter Fanon wrote from his hospital bed in Bethesda in the States to a friend, Roger Tyab. I won't try to read out the whole of the text, but you can take a look at it yourself. But his principal argument is that the main aim in life is to pursue those ideas that matter to you to the maximum possible. And I think in the very brief political life that he had, he did that. And for that reason, I would recommend him to you. And if you haven't read him yet, then I think you will be surprised and delighted by what you find when you do. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ken. That was really, really good. I feel quite ashamed that I've never heard of this psychiatrist and political philosopher before, because he was obviously an amazing man. If anybody has any questions they'd like to ask or any contributions they'd like to make, please could you raise your hand and I can make you into a panelist. If you, I see we have, yes, please put your hands up.
And Carol, if you can end the screen share as well, that would be helpful.
Yes, no, you have, the screen share has been ended, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just thee and me, Ken, now.
Okay.
So we're having hands are shooting up here. I was quite touched, actually. That last paragraph that you shared was very, very touching to read. Right, I have a few people have their hands up now. I'd like to ask, if I may, abuse my position as chair, just to ask, I was very interested in what you said about his idea that central government was not the way to go in replacing colonialism. Could you tell us a little bit more about his ideas?
Yes, I mean, his argument was very much that the people in a central government would almost inevitably be in the capital, in one of the major cities. And those in the major cities would be the most Europeanized of the sort of the colonized. And they would inevitably, in his view, try to impose a European model. He felt that moving or dispersing government amongst the more remote parts of the country and the villages would make sure, or at least give a better chance of the model of government that was developed becoming a true reflection of the culture of that people. And he wasn't, in this case, trying to hark back to some hypothetical ideal previous state. He was by no means falling victim to that. He simply felt that if government developed solely in the towns and the metropolis, then it wouldn't reflect the issues and concerns of those out in the country. And I'm afraid, that belief was borne out by experience. Many of the post-colonial African governments did focus on a sort of metropolitan elite rather than the needs of those in the countryside, and consequently a split developed between those parts of the population.
Thank you very much indeed. So we have several people who want to speak, and I'll go first of all to Mike Homfray. Mike Homfray, would you like to ask your question, please?
Yes, certainly. I was interested in the point you made about the Sartre preface, because certainly his wife felt that it perhaps focused much more than did Fanon's work on the issue of violence. Therefore, that's often been taken up as quite a central part of his ideas, whereas actually she felt it was actually a relatively small part and that Sartre had perhaps, by mentioning it in the preface so distinctly, had given it rather more emphasis than it deserved. The other point I'd like to ask is, I always felt that Fanon's work in some ways follows on quite well from the work of Du Bois, even though they were working in very sort of different milieu. But a lot of his ideas seem to me to be quite compatible. What do you think?
Yes, I'd agree with that. And in fact, in the sort of aforementioned reading list, there is one article which explores the links between Du Bois and Fanon. They're quite, well, there are similarities, obviously there are differences, but Du Bois himself was very much an American intellectual.
That's right.
As at some level, Fanon was a French intellectual, though he probably have balked at that description and obviously did become an Algerian citizen afterwards. So they developed in quite similar ways. They were obviously both educated within the educational structures of their own country, which at that point were very much white dominated. And part of Fanon's interest in drama maybe derives from the emphasis on Racine, which was very much part of the curriculum of French education at the time. But yes, there is quite a clear line that you can trace between the two of them. So, and their interests are consistent and quite compatible. So, thank you. But you're right in terms of the preface. The preface was, it certainly helped to get publicity for the book, but it did rather skew people's reading. It's quite a long preface. In fact, it's one of the longest prefaces I can remember.
Yes, indeed.
And the reader may be slightly exhausted even at the end of it and not get very far into the book. And there's a certain percentage of people that may only read the preface and derive their understanding from the book from that. And again, all that helps to sort of unbalance the perception of the book itself. And as I said, the section which deals with the case studies of the participants in the Algerian conflict shows Fanon's profound awareness of the damage that violence could cause to individuals.
Yes, indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike. If I can now go to Anthony Brain, if you can come in now and ask your question.
The first thing I want to say, I think for 10, 15 years in the 1880s, you had the national liberation struggle in Algeria, and they made deals between the different tribes and undermine those differences to fight French imperialism. French imperialism made a deal with them because they couldn't do, like when the Mahdi ruled Sudan in that film cartoon, they couldn't overthrow them. So they made a deal, but they waited their time to get back their position. There was an autonomous movement in the 30s, and most of the French capitalist class worked with them. But there was a massacre in 1945 after the Second World War that led to a mass struggle for autonomy and independence. But I mean, the Charlotans in the Second World War supported the nationalist bourgeoisie supporting British and French imperialism in the war. I mean, I don't know if it was influenced, but there was a capitalist nationalist. But also, one of the things I would have, I don't know. I mean, some Trotskyists thought that the FLN at certain points were a workers' and farmers' government. Obviously, the Vietnam struggle was led by North Vietnam, was a Stalinist force, and then they fought for land reform, and they had to overthrow capitalism in North Vietnam because, like in China with the Korean War, they would never leave them any room home, and then overthrown capitalism, they would have moved them with those internal forces to overthrow them. But and also away from the bourgeoisie of the Cuban Revolution, because that is a very big, because the struggle against racism, the struggle for land reform, it had to overthrow capitalism because the Americans sabotaged it when they nationalized some of their companies. But this is kind of with the Permanent Revolution of the bourgeois democratic test tied with the socialist test. But the other thing I want to talk about before I end, the workers' states have a big influence, and them have a big influence on the colonial world. If it hadn't been for the Russian, obviously they have their own autonomy to struggle for against imperialism and the national bourgeoisie and the fight for national liberation. And even if the worker states in its history have those battles, but if they weren't around, they'd be thicker on the ground. I mean, the Russian Revolution utilized that as a bargaining chip in the Third World War, the Russian and Chinese Revolution. And what Russia and China to do now, moving towards the Third World to undermine the imperialists, to get them cheap gas. And they're worried now about the North-South relationship could go more with the Russian and Chinese worker states, and they could weaken capitalism. So I think that dynamic of the Prime Revolution is getting destroyed through Stalinism. It's taking place. We go to deal. I think that's quite another topic. We should. Well, I'm doing some work on the world market and Russia going back to 8%.
And Anthony,
I'm going on the tangent. I'll leave it there.
Can we stick to the subject, please?
Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Anthony.
Anthony raises some interesting points there, and yes, there was a long prehistory to sort of conflict between the Algerians and the French, as Anthony has explained, but in terms of the way the ultimate result, if you like, of the Algerian War of Independence, there was significant fighting within different elements of those fighting against the French, and the outcome was very far from the ideal which Fanon would have liked. And going back to Anthony's point about the Russians and the Chinese sort of trying to get their own influence within other countries, Fanon was very much against the idea of aligning with either America or Russia, and wanted a sort of a pan-African approach rather than one which was driven by either of the superpowers. And again, history didn't ultimately pan out that way. But I think Anthony's point does illustrate very well that conflict persists to this day. Even now, you have China, America, India also to a certain level, trying to use countries within Africa to, I'll use the phrase, expand their own empire. It's not officially an empire, it's, if you like, more of a commercial empire than the sort of old-fashioned model. But that is part of the difficulty any country experiences in trying to establish its own independence. And it makes it, at some level, even more difficult for nations within Africa to align with each other if they are in effect being pursued by different suitors from outside Africa. None of that actually helps develop a real sense of internationalism. But anyway, that might be a subject for an entire separate series.
Thanks very much, Ken. And thank you very much, Anthony, for raising those important points. Can we go to Sean now? Sean Donoghue.
Hello. Thank you very much, Carol, and thank you very much, Ken. Yes, great talk. Thanks. I'm just reading this book here by Achille Membi. I don't know if you've come across him. He's a Ghanaian man who now works in South Africa. And it's just been published. And I'm delighted that he's resurrecting your man, what's it called?
Fanon.
Huh? Oh, Fanon. Yeah, he's resurrecting him. But reading this book, and all the talk about the decolonizing the African mind, and I find that a fascinating subject to decolonize, because he spoke a lot about this, Fanon, trying to get different ways of development, etc., like not basing it on the Western model. And but I think really, we need to decolonize the British mind, because for some reason or other, it's stuck. We've got this dreadful cognitive dissonance here, where people believe all this shit was fed to them, and hence we get a government, who's disempowered, everybody just about. The City of London is now ruling it totally, and I think it's the ideas in there, as you say, it's the French narrative. It operates in the French narrative, decolonization, with César as well, and various others. But I was trying to find out, while you were talking there, whether his books were published in French or in English. And from what I can see, they were published in English. So can you tell me anything about that?
Yeah, the books were the books were published in French and translated into English. And on the subject of translations, the translation of the Wretched of the Earth that's in the reading list is, if you like, the original English translation. There has been a later edition published by Grove Press, which at some level is actually a rather better English translation of the original French text. But I was interested in, I didn't quite catch the name of the book you were reading yourself.
It's called Out of the Dark Night, Essays on Decolonization.
Okay, thank you.
That you can't really read that there. Can you see that? Like the
I haven't heard of that, but I shall look out for it.
It's just been published.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Sean and Ken. We now have Steve Freeman, who'd like to contribute or ask a question.
Yes, Ken. I mean, I remember vaguely something about Fanon, reading about him back in the late 1960s, early 70s, and he was known then, and I've completely forgotten about him ever since. So I think it's great that you've given this talk and put him back on the map, and it was very interesting, and it put a lot of things. Again, your biography actually, it just shows I didn't really know any of that stuff, because I'd read a bit of his writings, but not about himself. So it puts a completely, I don't know who I thought he was actually, but it puts a great context around it. So I think that's good. But because therefore I don't know a lot about, I can't remember, that's brilliant. I can't remember a lot of what you said. I'm going to ask a couple of questions that just occur to me, and it may be completely off the wall, but it seems to me, he's really talking about what I would call national democratic revolutions in Africa, I think, or obviously based in with what's going on in Algeria. And it seems to me, again, maybe it's right, that he has a model of democracy, post-revolutionary democracy. In other words, he thinks that, from what if I've understood what you've said, if you establish your new independent republic, you don't want all the power concentrated in the capital city. You really want a democracy which is rooted in the people, as it were, down below. So I can see, in a way, from that and of course he's making the case that to free yourself, to get democracy, you might have to engage in violence in some circumstances, and violence may be the only part of the struggle. So that's why violence can be obviously part of the struggle for liberation and freedom and democracy. So my question is, and you also said, Ken, that he was an internationalist very much as well, not just, we could think of him as an Algerian nationalist, but that would obviously be wrong. But that's where his direct experience is. And so, and I presume again, the one there was what was the one about Africa that you had? I'm sorry, I didn't note it down. The African.
Towards the African Revolution, is that? Towards
the African Revolution, the last one as well. So that obviously speaks to a kind of democratic revolution spreading out across Africa. Obviously, he's got an African perspective. So the question I'm going to ask is, to me, he sounds like, to me, in my way of thinking, he is a Democrat and a Republican. Was he a socialist, would you say?
Yeah,
yeah.
He was very much so, and he was a Marxist, essentially, though his interpretation of Marx, sort of, as I suppose as any interpretation of Marx, has its differences from other people. And the one sort of major difference he had with Marx, I think, was Marx at some stage wrote that sort of colonialism was a necessary precursor to introducing capitalism to the third world. Now that's a gross caricature, probably, of what Marx actually said. Fanon wasn't convinced that that was a model that needed to be introduced to the third world, but he's certainly claimed by Marxists as one of theirs, and he did read Marx and Engels. His engagement with Trotskyism is more difficult to pin down. Interestingly, Peter Houdis, who wrote one of the biographies of Fanon that I mentioned in the reading list, states, and I'm just trying desperately to make sure I get the lady's name correctly
Raya
pronounced.
Donetskaya, was it you're talking?
That's the one, yes. She was the one who apparently introduced Houdis to Fanon and was, according to Houdis, a great enthusiast for him. And they did, in fact, meet in 1947 in Lyon when there was a sort of socialist conference. And the lady herself became briefly Trotsky's secretary in Mexico in 1937, but ultimately fell out with him when Trotsky continued to maintain, after the Molotov-Ribbentrop pact, that Russia was still a workers' state. But beyond that, there's not much evidence of Fanon's engagement with Trotskyism or Trotskyists, and of course, Dostoeva herself was only briefly a Trotskyist. But I mean, there's a book by Renata Zahar, again in the reading list, which does produce a more purely Marxist analysis of Fanon's ideas, which you might want to explore later.
Thank you, Ken. That was great. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. I've got some questions here from Ian Drummond. Clearly, he's having some problems with his internet in some way, so he's asked me to read his questions, Ken, which I'm going to do now. He said, have heard of him, but didn't know much about him. Had heard years ago he was sexist and supported interracial relationships only if the man was black and the woman white, as a reversal of the colonial power dynamic. Was that a smear, or was there anything to it?
Well, it is, in my view, a smear. And Fanon's wife was a white French woman, and she, in fact, got asked a question along those lines in the interview, again on the reading list, when she came to America, back to America in 1978. And her view was that Fanon actually didn't take such a view. And if you look at or read Black Skin, White Mask, what he's ultimately saying is that blackness and whiteness are constructs that are imposed on people by society. He wasn't a racist, and he wasn't, in my view, guilty of the accusations that Ian has encountered. And just sort of briefly picking up the fact that both Ian and Steve have said they don't immediately recall or recognize Fanon's name. It is true that sort of with the supposed demise of colonialism or overt colonialism in Africa, he became somebody who was examined in sort of academic circles, post-colonial discussions, etc., etc. One of the incidents, 2014, I think it was, where his name suddenly started to circulate a bit more prominently, was 2014 in New York, when the sort of New York grand jury finally decided to indict various New York policemen who'd strangled Eric Garner, an unarmed black man. And a quote started circulating shortly afterwards, which is attributed to Fanon. Now, I'll try and maybe add this as a footnote to the reading list, but basically the quote itself was a very garbled version of something from The Wretched of the Earth. The actual quote itself talks about the struggle of the Indo-Chinese people against colonialism, and the fact that it made it impossible for them to breathe. And the phrase "I can't breathe" obviously is one that's quite strongly associated with the Black Lives Matter movement and the killing of George Floyd, the phrase he uttered himself as he was being suffocated by the police. So Fanon sort of began to sort of become a bit more back into people's consciousness in 2014. And it's at that point that I think there was a sort of small flurry of new publications on his life and work. So, anyway, I just thought I'd mention that.
Yeah, there's a few more here, Kit. Thanks very much for that answer. He said his wife seems to have been a comrade in her own right after his death, from her response to Sartre's support for Israel in 1967. And his other question was, how did Fanon become an Algerian citizen as he died pre-independence? Was that with the provisional government in exile?
Essentially, yes. I mean, he adopted Algerian nationality, if as correctly observed. Technically, that didn't exist before he died, but he saw himself as an Algerian and very much identified with their struggle. And can you repeat the sort of first point again? But yes, that his wife was being comrade. I mean, his wife,
yes,
after his death, actually worked, I think, for about getting on for 16 years for the Algerian government as part of their sort of news agency. So she was politically active herself long after Fanon himself had died. And, she was, engaged in political discussions and activity at the same time as Fanon during their mutual studies in Lyon. So yeah, she has her own history, and she has her own entry on Wikipedia if people want to explore her life further. So.
Thank you very much. Obviously a very, very interesting couple. If I could, I know I'm chair, but if I could ask another question. As a psychiatrist, you said that he was very aware of the damage done to people by violence, and yet he still believed that there had to be violence in order to bring about a political change. Can you give us a little bit more detail about that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously that creates a conflict and a degree of difficulty in pursuing political aims while you're continuing to practice as a psychiatrist, something which he did, while he was in Tunis. He also was in a psychiatric hospital in Tunis. It's a dilemma that, he couldn't fully resolve himself. He tried but in his attempts to resolve it, at some level that strengthened his awareness of the need for radical change in the country. By that I mean, when he initially arrived in Algiers, he took the view that people with mental illness were best treated in their communities or in some sort of group activities. But it soon became apparent to him that attempting to involve, for example, Muslim men in sort of group activities where women were involved was culturally very difficult for them and didn't work. And in effect, that led him to the view that the Algerians were in effect sort of exiled or strangers within their own country because their natural culture wasn't compatible with the one which the French were trying to impose on them. But coming back to your original question, the conflict between the awareness of the damage violence caused and the advocacy of it, it was a difficulty, it was a conflict, and you can see in The Wretched of the Earth the extent to which that conflict is something he continued to struggle with himself. I don't think he identified a perfect resolution for it. I don't frankly think one exists, but it was certainly something that troubled him and continued to trouble him.
Yeah, that's interesting, but that he still believed there had to be some kind of violence to bring about regime change.
Because, again, he didn't think that was it was possible to do it without violence. And again, going back to that interview with his wife, which bear in mind was done in 1978, she was asked about what would happen in South Africa. And interestingly, in the light of history, she said there was absolutely no way there could be a negotiated end to that conflict. Now, as we know, that's not quite true. You can argue about the success or otherwise of that negotiated conclusion, but I think the end in South Africa was different from the end that, for instance, his wife envisaged. So, but like I said, did that resolution, was it a real resolution? You look at what's happening in South Africa now, and you may have doubts.
Interesting comment. I don't see anybody else's hands up at the moment, and so I'd like you to bring it to a close, Ken. Have you got any final comments you'd like to make?
Okay, only a very brief few final comments. I have put in the reading list a number of articles that point to various interpretations and views on Fanon. That doesn't mean I endorse all of them. It wouldn't be possible since there are some conflicting views there. But what I'm trying to do is provide a snapshot of the differing interpretations of Fanon that have developed over the decades since his death. And there is one article in there which does link Fanon to the riots in the UK in the 1980s, so people might want to explore that one. But thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ken. A very interesting, as I say, quite ashamed that I'd never heard of this gentleman before, and we'll definitely go away and read a lot more about him. Thank you so much. So thank you everyone for attending. Thank you for the questions and the contributions, and good night, everybody.